On the morning she thought her life was finally stable, Chenise discovered that the man she trusted most was quietly preparing to shatter her world. At 50 years old, Chenise lived in the quiet suburbs of Harmony City with her husband, Marlin. To neighbors, she was a soft-spoken housewife, a woman who spent her days cooking, sweeping, and making sure the home looked perfect. But behind that calm mask, Chenise carried a powerful secret. She was the regional director for the World Health Alliance, a global medical organization influencing policies and supplying hospitals across continents. Her annual salary was around $155,000, and her work touched millions of lives. Yet Marlin never knew. To him, Chenise's life was nothing more than housework, while she silently managed projects worth billions across borders. Chenise often asked herself why she had chosen Marlin. They first met at a cultural gathering in 2010 when she was only 33 and he was 36. Back then, Marlin was warm, attentive, and carried a charming way of speaking that made her heart settle. He noticed small things, how she tilted her head when she laughed, or the way her voice softened when she spoke about her late father. Where are you watching from today? Kindly hit like, comment, and subscribe to this channel for more. Chenise believed she had found her partner for life, someone who would walk beside her through every storm. Within a year they married, and at first, she thought happiness would last forever. But slowly, the dream began to crumble. Marlin was stubborn. He clung to a job at a small transport firm that barely covered food and utilities. When Chenise gently suggested he explore better opportunities, he brushed her off. "I am not your employee," he would say with sharpness. "Stop trying to control me." Once, Chenise arranged a role for him in the administration unit of the World Health Alliance, a position requiring only simple communication skills, with a salary more than double his current earnings. She personally spoke to the hiring officer to keep the role open. But when she told Marlin, his face darkened. "So you think I'm worthless? That I need you to hand me a job? Don't meddle in my life." His words pierced her, and for the first time, she questioned if the man she married could ever accept help. Still, Chenise endured. Every month, she transferred $1,500 into Marlin's account as a living allowance, pretending it came from her family savings. He always finished it within 2 weeks. Soon after, the complaints would begin. Food was too costly, transport fees were too high, and life was unfair. What Marlin never admitted was that most of the money went to sneakers he didn't need, video games he played until midnight, and flashy gadgets to impress his friends. Chenise said nothing. For her, the money wasn't the wound. The wound was his growing coldness. He never asked if she was tired after flying between 2 countries in 1 week. He never noticed when she stayed awake past midnight, approving international contracts. In Marlin's eyes, Chenise was just a dependent wife relying on his small paycheck. One Saturday morning, Chenise's mother, Tanisha, came to help clean the house. Chenise was deep in online meetings with board members from across the globe, her laptop glowing with faces of powerful officials. When Marlin walked in, he threw his keys onto the table and muttered, "Another stranger in my house again. Can't I get peace?" Tanisha froze, her kind face stiff with shock. Chenise stood quickly, holding back her anger. "She is not a stranger. She is my mother, and she came to help us." But Marlin only shrugged. "That's how you see it. I have a right to feel uncomfortable in my own home." Chenise turned away, blinking back tears. That day, something cracked in her spirit. For the first time, she realized her marriage was built on sand. From that day onward, the house felt heavy with silence. Chenise and Marlin still lived under the same roof, ate dinner at the same table, and sometimes watched the same television show. But the warmth that once existed between them had vanished. There were no more unexpected hugs, no more whispered goodnights, no more laughter over small jokes. It was as though the bond that once tied them had dried into dust, leaving behind only routine. Marlin grew increasingly irritable, quick to anger over small things. A towel folded the wrong way could spark a lecture. A television remote placed on the couch instead of the table became a reason to scold. Once, when the coffee machine broke down, even though he was the last one to use it, Marlin shouted that Chenise had probably damaged it. Bit by bit, she began to feel like a servant in her own home. Her worth reduced to a target for his frustrations. One evening, Chenise returned from a tense virtual board meeting with senior directors from the World Health Alliance. She hadn't even removed her shoes when Marlin held up one of his shirts in the kitchen. "This isn't ironed. Do you ever do anything right?" he snapped. Chenise stared at him, her lips trembling with a hollow laugh. Only hours earlier, she had finalized a medical supply deal worth over $5 million, negotiating with global hospitals. Now, here she was being questioned about ironing a shirt. She said nothing. Experience had taught her that the more she replied, the more Marlin twisted her words into accusations. Silence became her only shield. But inside, her spirit was draining. She was once a woman who inspired teams across continents. Yet within her own walls, she was treated like someone with no value. Her breaking point came when she fell sick. Chenise caught a flu that left her weak, burning with fever, barely able to get out of bed. Her body ached, her skin was hot, and she shivered under blankets. She thought maybe, just maybe, Marlin would show a little care. Instead, he stood at the doorway, his face blank. "Hurry up and get better. I don't have time to take care of you," he said before walking away. The words cut deep. Not because she needed him to fetch medicine, but because his heart had become colder than a stranger's. No husband should say that to a wife. That night, lying alone in the darkness, Chenise asked herself a question she could no longer silence. How did the man who once held her hand at their wedding, promising to walk beside her forever, become the one who wounded her the most? Sleepless nights followed. Chenise often woke at 2 a.m., staring at the ceiling, her chest heavy with doubt. Why was a strong woman, a global leader trusted with decisions that shaped hospitals around the world, trapped in a loveless marriage with a man who saw her as less than he was? She never told anyone, not even her mother, Tanisha, who loved her deeply. When Tanisha called, Chenise forced a smile into her voice. "I'm fine, Mama. Everything is okay." She couldn't bear to reveal her pain, not to the woman who had always protected her like a precious jewel. She didn't want anyone to see her weakness. But Marlin would soon drag her mother into the storm in the worst way possible. It was a Saturday afternoon when Tanisha arrived at Chenise's house carrying a pot of her daughter's favorite goat stew and a basket of fresh fruit. Chenise's heart warmed at the sight. They were laughing quietly together when Marlin walked in. He paused at the doorway, his face tightening. With a loud sigh, he dropped his bag and muttered, "Again. Always someone sitting in this house. Can't I get peace?" Tanisha froze, startled by his tone, but forced a gentle smile. "I only came to see my daughter. I won't stay long." Marlin shrugged, opened the fridge and said coldly, "I don't want to eat with outsiders. Some people don't understand boundaries." Chenise stood rooted to the floor, her chest tightening as tears pricked her eyes. Tanisha hesitated, set down her bowl slowly and whispered, "I think I should go. I'll come another time." Watching her mother leave in silence, Chenise's heart broke. That night, she knew the marriage had crossed a line it might never return from. That evening, Chenise stood in her kitchen long after her mother had left, her hands pressed against the counter, her breath heavy. The silence in the house was unbearable, like walls closing in on her. She thought back to the vows Marlin had spoken 17 years earlier, words of love and protection. Where had that man gone? Now she lived with a stranger who saw kindness as weakness. The following weeks grew colder. Marlin no longer greeted her when he came home. Instead, he looked for faults, a misplaced spoon, a towel left on a chair. Each small complaint chipped away at her spirit. But Chenise held her silence. She told herself she could endure. After all, she had endured boardroom battles with world leaders. Surely she could endure her own husband. Yet deep inside, a storm was brewing that silence could no longer hold. The storm came unexpectedly. One late evening, Chenise was at her office desk at home, reviewing urgent reports from the World Health Alliance. Her vision blurred, her head spun, and suddenly the documents before her turned to haze. She tried to stand, but her legs weakened. The last thing she remembered was the sound of her pen dropping onto the desk before everything went dark. When she opened her eyes, she was lying in a hospital bed at Unity Hospital, and 4 in her arm. Her body felt heavy, her chest tight. A doctor leaned close, his voice calm but serious. "You collapsed due to exhaustion, but we need further tests. Some of your readings are concerning." Chenise closed her eyes. For years, she had poured her energy into both her secret role and her failing marriage. Now her body was calling for rest. 2 days later, she was moved into a private room. The doctor returned, holding test results with a grave expression. Chenise sat up slowly, her heart pounding. "We found a growth in your pancreas," he said carefully. "Fortunately, it is early, and we can begin treatment right away. But this will not be easy." Chenise's ears buzzed. She heard the words, but they felt far away. Not because she feared the illness, but because she feared facing it alone. That night, she reached for her phone with trembling hands. She texted Marlin. "I am in Unity Hospital. I need to talk." Hours passed. No reply. He called. His phone rang, then went to voicemail. Her chest ached as she lay back on the bed. The man who once promised to hold her hand through sickness had abandoned her in her first true moment of need. The next week was brutal. The treatments began, draining her strength, thinning her once thick hair, dulling her taste. Chenise barely recognized her reflection in the mirror, yet her eyes still burned with a quiet fire. Each day, she fought alone in the hospital room, her secrets still hidden from her family. She lied to her mother, saying she was on a business trip, because she couldn't bear to worry her. She believed she was strong enough to carry it alone. But in the quiet of the nights, tears ran down her cheeks. Not for the sickness, but for the emptiness beside her. Still she endured. Chenise had faced global health crises, leading with courage. She told herself she could face this crisis too, even if her home was now colder than the hospital walls. Then, one Thursday afternoon, the door of her hospital room opened. Chenise thought she was dreaming when Marlin walked in. For a moment, her heart softened. But the look on his face was not concern. He carried no flowers, no gentle words, only a folder in his hand. "You're here," Chenise whispered, her voice hoarse with exhaustion. Marlin didn't answer. He dropped the folder on her bedside table and spoke in a tone as cold as stone. "I've filed for divorce. The house and the car will remain in my name. That's fair. As for you," he paused, his lips curling, "I'm not even sure how long you'll be around." Chenise stared at him, stunned. Not because he wanted to leave her. She had long expected that. But because of the cruelty dripping from his words. Her chest tightened, but she refused to let him see her break. She pressed her lips together and nodded. "Take whatever you want. Thank you for coming," she said quietly. Marlin blinked, surprised by her calmness. He shrugged, turned and muttered, "Not like you have a choice." The door clicked shut behind him. For a long moment, Chenise lay motionless, her body weak but her spirit suddenly awakening. A cold smile touched her lips. "You just woke up the real me, Marlin," she whispered. For years, she had sacrificed in silence. For years, she had let him live under a shadow he never even knew she created. But not anymore. In that hospital bed, Chenise knew something with absolute clarity. The man who tried to discard her at her weakest had just made the greatest mistake of his life. With new resolve, Chenise reached for the phone by her bed and dialed one number she trusted. It rang only once before a calm voice answered. "Eric," she said, her voice steady though her body trembled. Eric was her deputy at the World Health Alliance, the one man who knew the full truth of her position. "I need your help with something." Silence followed for a moment, then Eric replied firmly. "I've been waiting for this call. Just say the word." Chenise closed her eyes and nodded, though he could not see her. The storm inside her had found direction. If Marlin thought she would crumble, he had forgotten who she truly was. 3 days later, Eric visited Chenise at Unity Hospital. He brought no flowers, no sympathy card, only a black leather briefcase. He set it on her bedside table and asked softly, "Are you sure you want to go through with this plan?" Chenise's eyes, though tired, burned with certainty. "Yes," she said, "and I want it to begin tomorrow." Eric nodded. He was the only one who knew that Chenise had carefully hidden her identity, letting her mother's name appear on public documents to protect her privacy. 4 years she had built quietly, shielding her achievements from Marlin's pride. But now, she realized her kindness had been misplaced. It was time to reveal a part of her truth, not with words but with actions. The next morning, Chenise signed a short but powerful letter. It was addressed to the management of Transglobal Logistics, the company where Marlin worked. The letter terminated a major supply agreement between Transglobal and the World Health Alliance. That contract had provided more than 60% of Transglobal's revenue last quarter, and Marlin had been boasting for months that he was the one who secured it. He never knew the mysterious partner was his own wife. At exactly 9 a.m., Eric sent the termination letter. By 2 p.m., that her parents took her back to their farm in the countryside and cut ties with her former life. For them, removing her from the city was the only way to erase the shame. Chenise felt no bitterness toward Rochelle. The young woman had been reckless, yes, but it was Marlin who had destroyed the vows he made. Chenise's final round of treatment ended on a cool autumn morning. The doctor smiled gently and said, "Your results are clear." She closed her eyes, breathed deeply, and for the first time in months, her heart felt light. She had survived both illness and betrayal. When she returned to her team at the World Health Alliance 2 months later, they welcomed her with applause. Eric handed her a mug that read, "Welcome back, boss." Chenise smiled, realizing she had not only survived but risen stronger. No longer bound by a loveless marriage, no longer silenced by pride, she was free, and determined to live the rest of her life on her own terms. Back at her lakeside home in Harmony City, Chenise stood on the balcony one evening, a warm shawl wrapped around her shoulders. The breeze carried the scent of pine trees and the soft sound of water lapping against the shore. She ran her fingers across her short, newly growing hair and smiled faintly. It had been months since her diagnosis, months of pain, betrayal, and awakening. Yet here she was, alive and whole. 4 years she had lived to please Marlin, shrinking herself so he would feel tall. Now she lived for herself. The silence in her new home was not heavy like before. It was peaceful, like a song only her spirit could hear. Meanwhile, Marlin's world was collapsing. Without Transglobal, no company wanted to risk hiring him. His termination record had spread quietly, and the whispers about his affair with Rochelle followed him everywhere. One by one, friends who once enjoyed his company disappeared, unwilling to be associated with his shame. His nights were filled with calls from creditors, his days with rejection emails. To survive, he took a night shift job at a delivery warehouse. The pay was barely enough for food, let alone the mountain of debts he had accumulated. The man who once mocked Chenise for being just a housewife was now scrubbing the floors of a loading dock, invisible to the world. Chenise, however, began to blossom. She approved Eric's plan to appoint a new deputy to handle most of her duties. For the first time in decades, she allowed herself to slow down. She spent mornings walking by the lake, afternoons sipping tea on her porch, and evenings reading the books she once had no time for. Invitations for dinners and business events poured in, but she accepted only a few. Chenise had no need to prove herself anymore. She had already fought her battles and won. What she craved now was peace, peace she had long been denied. But peace did not mean loneliness. Chenise's circle of true friends and family grew closer. Her mother, Tanisha, visited often, carrying pots of goat stew and laughter that filled Chenise's home. "My daughter," Tanisha would say proudly, "you are stronger than any storm." Chenise would smile softly, remembering the day Marlin had called her mother an outsider. That memory no longer brought her pain. Instead, it reminded her of how far she had come. She had once hidden her tears. Now she wore her scars as proof of survival. Word of Chenise's journey began to spread beyond Harmony City. An international women's conference invited her to speak about resilience, leadership, and dignity. Standing on that stage, looking at hundreds of women from across the continent, Chenise felt something she had not felt in years: joy. She shared her story without bitterness, speaking not of revenge but of strength. True power, she told them, is not in what others give you. It is in what you refuse to surrender. The applause that followed was thunderous. That day, Chenise knew her story had become bigger than herself. It was now a torch for others to see their own worth. Marlin, on the other hand, was drowning. His apartment grew darker by the week, cluttered with unpaid bills and empty bottles. He had sold his watch collection, his sneakers, even the last pieces of furniture he once boasted about. Still, the debts chased him. Collection agents knocked on his door. Former colleagues avoided his gaze on the street. Even Rochelle's family had cut him off completely. The man who once sneered at Chenise's sacrifices now faced the bitter truth of living without her shadow. Pride had been his fortress, but now it was his prison. One evening, Marlin tried one last desperate attempt. He arrived at the headquarters of the World Health Alliance, dressed in a wrinkled shirt, his eyes sunken from sleepless nights. He asked to see Chenise, pleading with the receptionist, but the guards had clear instructions. He was not to step near her office again. Marlin stood outside the glass doors, watching people walk past, until the weight of shame forced him to turn away. That night, he returned to his small apartment, sat in the dark, and whispered to himself, "I had it all, and I threw it away." Chenise, meanwhile, embraced new beginnings. She purchased a modest lakeside cottage in Greenvale, a quiet town not far from the city. It was smaller than the house she once shared with Marlin, but it was hers alone. She filled it with soft colors, fresh flowers, and the sound of music she loved. Every corner breathed peace. "This," she thought one morning as she sipped her tea on the porch, "is what freedom feels like." For the first time in years, Chenise slept peacefully through the night, no longer haunted by arguments, no longer waking at 2 a.m. with questions of why. On one golden afternoon, Eric visited her lakeside home. They sat on the porch, watching the water shimmer. "You look different," Eric said warmly. Chenise chuckled. "I feel different. Lighter." Eric nodded. "Have you thought about love again?" She shook her head gently. "Not now. Maybe one day. But for now, I am happy as I am." Eric smiled, saying nothing more. They sat in comfortable silence, the lake reflecting the setting sun. Chenise realized then that healing was not about rushing into someone else's arms. It was about learning to hold herself again, whole and unbroken. That evening, as she watched the stars appear above the lake, Chenise reflected on her journey. She had once been a woman who gave her heart to a man unworthy of it, a woman who sacrificed in silence without recognition. But now she was something more, a survivor, a leader, and a woman who chose self-respect above all else. "In the end," she whispered softly to the night, "I became the author of my own story." The breeze carried her words across the water, and Chenise smiled. She knew her scars would always remind her of the storm, but they also reminded her of the strength she had found when the storm passed. As the weeks passed, Chenise's health continued to improve. Her doctors at Unity Hospital confirmed that her recovery was steady and strong. Each appointment filled her with gratitude. She remembered the days she could hardly lift her head, and now she walked by the lake with renewed energy. Chenise no longer wore wigs to hide her short curls. Instead, she let the sun kiss her natural hair. She carried herself with quiet confidence, a woman who had faced fire and walked out refined like gold. To those who knew her story, she became more than a leader. She became a symbol of resilience. Meanwhile, Marlin's struggles deepened. His night shift job at the delivery warehouse barely kept him afloat. Rent was overdue, and the friend who once sheltered him began to grow weary of his presence. "You need to fix your life, Marlin," the friend said one night. "You can't keep depending on others." The words echoed the truth Marlin had ignored for years. Pride had blinded him. Now he had nothing left but memories of the comfort Chenise once provided. He tried reaching out again through mutual friends, but Chenise had made it clear. Her chapter with him was closed forever. Chenise, free from his shadow, embraced opportunities she once declined. The World Health Alliance nominated her to represent the region at a global health summit in Geneva. Standing before world leaders, Chenise shared her experiences with clarity and strength. Her speech was not just about health policies. It was about resilience, leadership, and dignity. "A community thrives," she told them, "when women are not silenced but empowered." The applause was thunderous, echoing across the grand hall. In that moment, Chenise realized her story had transcended her own pain. It was now a message of hope for countless others. Back in Harmony City, gossip about Marlin became a lesson whispered among families. Parents told their sons, "Respect the women who stand beside you, or you will lose them." Friends who once admired his charm now avoided his path. Debt collectors knocked at his door more frequently, their voices harsh. With no savings and no steady support, Marlin sold the last of his possessions, a motorbike he had once proudly polished every weekend. Even then, the money could not cover his mounting obligations. Each night, he lay on his thin mattress, staring at the ceiling, haunted by the memory of Chenise's calm voice revealing her true power. Chenise's mother, Tanisha, often reminded her, "Child, your story is not just for you. It is for every woman who feels trapped, who feels voiceless." Chenise would nod, her heart swelling with both sorrow and pride. She had once hidden her strength, believing that protecting Marlin's pride was love. But now she understood that true love never demanded silence. By sharing her journey, she had not only freed herself but lit a path for others. Women began writing to her, some from small villages, others from big cities, thanking her for reminding them of their worth. Marlin, however, could not escape the consequences of his choices. One afternoon, as he walked into the delivery warehouse, he overheard two workers whispering about him. "That's the one who cheated on his wife," one said. "The woman who was actually the big director." Marlin lowered his head, his ears burning with shame. Every corner he turned seemed to echo his downfall. He realized then that reputation, once broken, is harder to repair than glass. For the first time, he admitted to himself that Chenise had been his anchor, his shield, his entire foundation, and he had thrown it away. Chenise, meanwhile, grew into her new life with grace. She furnished her Greenvale home with simplicity, planting flowers in the garden and hanging wind chimes that sang with the breeze. Each morning, she brewed tea and listened to birdsong, her spirit nourished by peace. Invitations for courtship came her way, but she turned them down kindly. "Not yet," she would say. "I am still enjoying the gift of myself." She had learned that love without respect was a cage, and freedom without peace was incomplete. For Chenise, this season was about healing, not rushing into another storm. Marlin's health began to mirror his broken life. Stress etched deep lines across his face, and sleepless nights left his body weak. Debt collectors threatened legal action, and the friend who once sheltered him finally asked him to leave. With nowhere else to go, Marlin rented a small single room in a crowded apartment block on the city's edge. The walls were damp, the ceiling leaked, and the air was thick with despair. For the first time in his life, he faced the world without Chenise's unseen support. His pride had brought him low, and humility came too late. One weekend, Chenise was invited to a women's retreat in Greenvale. Surrounded by sisters, mothers, and daughters, she shared her testimony under the wide African sky. Her voice carried warmth and wisdom. "I once gave my heart to someone unworthy. I once hid my strength to protect another's pride. But I learned that true happiness begins the moment you choose self-respect above everything else." The women cheered, some wiping tears from their eyes. Chenise's scars had become her crown. Her past a story of survival that now inspired others to rise from their own ashes. That evening, as Chenise walked back to her lakeside cottage, she felt the cool breeze brush her cheeks. The stars twinkled above, and the water shimmered under the moonlight. She paused, closing her eyes, and whispered a prayer of gratitude. She had survived illness, betrayal, and heartbreak. She had watched the man who once tried to crush her dignity crumble under the weight of his own choices. Yet she carried no hatred, only peace. Chenise knew her story was not one of revenge, but of rebirth. In the end, she thought, the greatest victory is living free. With a gentle smile, she stepped into her home, her heart finally whole. As the months rolled by, Chenise's influence stretched far beyond Harmony City. She was invited to universities, women's groups, and leadership forums across Africa and abroad. Her story became a beacon, shared in magazines and on television, a tale of a woman who had risen from betrayal to triumph. Yet Chenise remained humble. Each time she stood before a crowd, she reminded them, "I am not special. I am simply a woman who chose not to be silent. And you too have that power." Her words became seeds, planted in the hearts of women and men alike, growing into courage they never knew they had. Marlin, meanwhile, faded into the background of the city he once walked with pride. His debts mounted until creditors dragged him to court. The once confident man who mocked Chenise now stood trembling before judges, stripped of dignity. Those who remembered him shook their heads and whispered, "He had a treasure and threw it away." Alone in his small room, he often replayed his past, the moments Chenise had begged for his kindness, the times she had sacrificed without complaint. Regret weighed on him heavier than any debt collector's knock. But regret could not turn back time. One morning, Chenise sat by the lake outside her Greenvale cottage, sipping tea as the mist curled gently over the water. Eric joined her, carrying a small bouquet of flowers. "The world is proud of you," he said softly. Chenise smiled, her eyes shining with quiet peace. "I am proud of myself," she replied. "For the first time, I know what it means to be free." They sat together in silence, watching the ripples on the water. Chenise knew she did not need another man to complete her. She had already completed herself. What the world saw as scars, she now carried as strength. As seasons changed, Chenise planted a small garden behind her cottage. Bright flowers bloomed under her care, each petal a reminder of life renewed. Neighbors often passed by, greeting her with respect. "That is a strong woman," they would say. Mothers told their daughters, "Learn from her story. Respect yourself. Never settle for less." Chenise had become more than an individual. She had become a living proverb, her journey a tale that mothers would tell at evening fires, a reminder that silence is not love, and dignity is never negotiable. On her 50th birthday, Chenise stood on her porch as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of gold. She raised her cup of tea, whispering a final reflection. "I once gave my heart to someone unworthy. I once hid my strength for the sake of another's pride. But in the end I found myself. And that is the greatest love story of all." The breeze carried her words across the lake, settling like wisdom upon the water. Far away, Marlin sat alone in his cramped room, haunted by what he had lost. But Chenise felt no hatred, only peace. Her life had become her own again, a life of strength, freedom, and joy. And so her story closed, not as a tale of revenge, but as a folktale of rebirth, reminding every listener, true happiness begins when self-respect becomes your foundation.